Roy stands at the edge of what used to be his best field and looks at nothing. I don't mean nothing in a poetic way. I mean it in the literal sense, because the topsoil is gone. What remains is a pale, chalky subsoil the color of old concrete, and the very wind that carried the rest of it away is still blowing across the flats. Behind him, just one farm over, the tree rows are still standing tall. The fields tucked behind those trees are dark and intact, holding the same deep color they've always had, while every other farm, in every other direction, looks exactly like Roy's ruined ground. One man made a choice 20 years ago that every neighbor he had thought was a mistake. This is the story of what that decision actually was, and, more importantly, what it cost him to hold on to it when the world told him to let go. Dustin didn't just inherit a farm back in 1987. He inherited a decision that had been decades in the making.
The 480 acres in southwestern Kansas came with all the usual burdens, including a John Deere tractor that needed work, debt he hadn't asked for, and ground that had been farmed hard for 30 years. But the land also came with shelter belts, consisting of 6 rows planted along the north and west edges in the late 1930s as part of FDR's Prairie States Forestry Project. These green ash and eastern red cedar trees had grown so tall that you could spot them from the county road a half-mile out. His grandfather had planted those trees as part of the largest environmental program the federal government had ever tried to pull off. Between 1935 and 1942, the U.S. Forest Service put 220 million trees across 6 states in a 100-mile-wide corridor stretching from North Dakota all the way down to Texas. The logic was simple because the wind that had turned the plains into a catastrophe needed something to run into. And since slow wind doesn't move soil, the trees acted as a physical brake. By the time Dustin took over, the shelter belts were showing their age, with gaps where trees had died and a few leaning sections where the soil had heaved during a wet spring years ago. They didn't look like much to a stranger, but Dustin knew exactly what he was looking at. He'd spent his childhood summers on this farm following his grandfather along the tree lines in the early morning, and the old man would point out how the soil stayed dark and loose right up to the trunks. Meanwhile, the exposed corners of that same field would go pale and crusty by August. But his grandfather never used technical terms to explain why. He just walked the lines and let the boys see what the trees were doing with his own eyes. The farm right next door had already seen its shelter belts pulled out by the roots. Roy had taken over that operation from his uncle 2 years earlier and spent his first season doing what everyone else was doing, which meant running a bulldozer along the fence rows. He pushed the old tree lines into massive piles, burning what would catch fire and burying the rest deep underground until his fields were clean, perfect rectangles from edge to edge. This meant a 24-row planter could make a full pass without the driver having to adjust the steering a single time. Dustin stood at his own fence line and looked at Roy's bare ground. Then he turned to look at his own messy tree rows and realized the 2 farms shared a property line, but almost nothing else. Roy's side was built for the massive equipment that was coming and the scale the market was rewarding. But Dustin's side looked like a relic from 30 years ago. It was something his grandfather had built when the memory of the black blizzards was still fresh enough to be terrifying. He went home that night and called no one. And he didn't consult a single expert before making his decision, quietly, in the way that only makes sense to people who have watched a piece of ground long enough to understand its language. He wasn't going to pull those trees. He wasn't even going to let the gaps in the rows get any worse. What he didn't know yet, and what would take 20 years to fully sink in, was that he wasn't just keeping a few old trees alive. He was maintaining the only thing standing between his livelihood and the same fate that was already creeping toward Roy's clean, open, and completely unprotected ground. The pressure didn't come from just one direction. It came from everywhere at once, which is how pressure usually works when the whole world has decided to move in one way and you're the only one standing still. During the late 1980s in southwestern Kansas, agriculture wasn't a subtle business. And the get big or get out era wasn't just a slogan someone made up later to describe the history. It was the actual logic used by banks, equipment dealers, and your own neighbors, because back then, scale was the only answer anyone wanted to hear. Center pivot irrigation systems were going up across the county like mechanical sunflowers, each one watering a quarter section in a single slow rotation, while multi-row planters seemed to get wider every single season. The farmers who were surviving, and plenty who weren't but hadn't realized it yet, were the ones who could push more acres through bigger equipment at a faster pace. Every acre you kept in trees was an acre that wasn't producing corn or wheat, and that math was simple enough that nobody was exactly wrong about it. A 24-row planter running clean from one fence line to the next is genuinely more efficient than a machine that has to lift at the tree rows, turn short, and come back around. Efficiency compounds over time, and after 10 seasons of work, the difference in the total bushels you harvest is not a small number. Roy finally pulled out the last of his shelter belts in 1989, spending 4 days with a bulldozer he hired from a man in the next county over. When the work was done, he'd recovered 11 acres of cropland that had been growing green ash and cedar for 50 years, and he used that space to justify a wider planter that fall. Even though the machine was used, it was wider than anything he'd ever run before, and his yields that first year were genuinely higher because the machine ran cleaner and he simply had more ground under the seed. He called Dustin in November to talk about the success, not to be mean, but in the way a neighbor does when he thinks he's found a secret worth sharing. The numbers were right there on the page. Dustin's bank had a different kind of conversation with him that same fall, when his loan officer, a man named Gary who wore the same corduroy jacket to every meeting, explained that the shelter belts were actually reducing his collateral value. Lenders weren't looking at those tree lines and seeing a way to protect the soil. They were seeing acres that couldn't be pledged against the loan because they weren't producing a crop. Gary called it the tree problem twice in that one meeting, making it clear that the bank saw his conservation efforts as a measurable financial drain. Dustin didn't pull his trees. Instead of hiring a bulldozer, he went home and spent a Saturday walking the east and north edges of his property, where a few gaps had opened up over the years. These were spots where trees had died back and nobody had bothered to replace them, so he measured the gaps by his own stride and wrote the locations down in a new notebook. He'd started keeping records that spring, logging yield numbers by field zone and taking moisture readings after every rain. The following April, he planted new rows in those empty gaps using young eastern red cedar stock he got from a conservation program. He ran a small utility tractor along the young rows to cultivate around the saplings that first summer, using a machine so modest compared to Roy's equipment that Roy's hired hands actually stopped their work to watch him. They didn't say anything. They just watched the way you watch something that doesn't quite make sense to your brain. The ridicule started out low-key that year with a few comments at the co-op or a joke at the machinery auction, but it eventually found a rhythm. It got easier for people to make fun of him as the years passed, especially as Roy's operation kept growing while Dustin's stayed exactly the same size. What nobody wanted to hear Dustin explain, and what he mostly didn't try to say because you can't explain something to someone who's already decided they're right, was what those trees were actually doing while everyone else was laughing. Most people who've never stood next to a shelter belt in a bad wind don't know what they actually do. And the people laughing at Dustin definitely didn't understand the physics of it. Wind erosion doesn't creep up on a farmer. It has a specific threshold of about 13 miles per hour at the soil surface, depending on how dry the ground is. Below that speed, almost nothing moves. But once you cross that line, the fine organic particles that took decades of root decay to build start lifting into the air. Once those particles lift, they bump into others and knock them loose too, which means a field that looked fine at noon can lose inches of its best topsoil by 3 in the afternoon. A row of mature trees interrupts that wind before it ever reaches the ground. And while it doesn't stop the air entirely, it slows it down enough to keep the soil in place. Porosity is the key here, because a solid wall actually creates worse turbulence on the backside, but a permeable row of trees allows some air through while dropping the speed below the erosion threshold. A shelter belt with trees standing 20 meters tall protects the ground for about 400 meters on the downwind side, which is roughly 20 times the height of the trees. On Dustin's farm, a single well-placed row was sheltering ground 60 or 80 yards deep before the wind could build up enough speed to matter again. Dustin could see the proof in his yield maps without needing a scientist to explain the formula to him.
His winter wheat in the protected zones, those long rectangles of ground sitting downwind from the tree lines, consistently produced more than his exposed corners. This didn't happen every single year, and the difference wasn't always huge when the weather was perfect, but the trees proved their worth during the dry seasons. The cedars were also catching snow, which is vital in a region where winter moisture usually falls horizontally rather than vertically. A dense row of trees acts like a snow fence, pulling drifts out of the wind and piling them on the downwind side where they sit through February and March. That snow eventually melts and releases slowly into the soil, meaning the same fields being protected from the wind were also banking moisture that Roy's open ground was losing to evaporation. None of this was a secret, and the original Prairie States Forestry Project had documented all these facts as early as 1942. The knowledge was sitting right there in Extension Office reports and university files, or in the memories of older farmers who knew exactly why those trees were planted in the first place. It had just stopped being the kind of knowledge that mattered to anyone trying to run a 24-row planter across a perfectly clean field. Roy pointed to the sacrifice zone every chance he got, noting that the first 2 rows of crops nearest the trees always yielded less because of the shade and root competition. That part was real, and Dustin never tried to argue against it. But Roy was only looking at the seam where the trees and the crops met. Using that small edge to judge the whole system was like measuring the value of a barn by looking at the dirt on the door. Dustin kept writing it all down anyway, tracking yields by zone, moisture levels, and the specific dates when he saw dust moving on Roy's ground compared to his own. He wasn't trying to build a legal case against his neighbor. He was just trying to understand what his grandfather had known by instinct. He wanted to know how this specific piece of ground behaved and what it needed to stay healthy. The notebook got thicker as the years went by, and the tree lines grew taller, while Roy's operation kept expanding into clean, open ground that had no idea what was coming. The drought of the mid-1990s didn't arrive with a sudden crash or a single bad season, but instead it showed up the way things usually do in southwestern Kansas. It was a slow and grinding sequence that didn't really announce itself until you were already standing right in the middle of it. Dustin first noticed the change in March of 1994, when the soil crusted over much faster than it should have after a light spring rain. He took a moisture reading in his north field that afternoon, and when the numbers came back lower than any March entry in his notebook, he knew the ground was thirsty. He planted his crop anyway and watched the wheat come up thin and patchy, eventually accepting a smaller yield without making much of a fuss, because dry years were just part of the life he chose. The second year was where things started to get serious. By the spring of 1995, the exposed fields on Roy's place were doing something that wasn't dramatic enough for a news crew to photograph, but it was unmistakable if you knew how to read the land. The fine surface layer is the dark and loose organic part of the soil that sits right on top of the mineral base. And since it is the first thing the wind touches, it started to drift. It wasn't blowing in huge, visible clouds yet, but it was moving quietly and settling against the fence posts or mounding up in the corners where the wire turned. By the time May rolled around, the low spots along Roy's north fence line were filled with a thin skin of displaced dirt, leaving the ground it came from a shade paler than it used to be. Dustin's fields were losing moisture too, because a drought doesn't negotiate with anyone. But the cedars he planted had caught the snow the previous winter. That snow was still releasing water into the root zone slowly,
acting more like a soaked sponge than a wide-open faucet, and the broken wind meant his surface soil stayed damp much longer after the few rains they did get. His wheat yields were definitely down, and he wasn't trying to pretend otherwise to his neighbors, but his numbers were only down by a third, while Roy's had dropped by half. That gap in production wasn't about luck or where they placed their rain gauges, but it was the direct result of the trees standing guard. Roy ended up borrowing money against his equipment in 1995 to cover the shortfall in his operating costs. And then he had to do it all over again in 1996, when the third dry year hit. He mentioned the loans to Dustin at the co-op one morning in a tone that made it sound like a temporary hiccup that everyone was dealing with. Dustin didn't say a word about the dirt piling up on the fence lines, because he'd learned a long time ago that pointing out evidence nobody asked you to find is the fastest way to end a friendship. What he did instead was go back home and open up his notebook. He had been keeping track of his numbers for 8 years by that point, so he laid the data from the dry years against the wet ones to see the truth of the situation. He looked at the gap between his protected zones and his exposed corners, then compared what Roy described losing against what had actually disappeared from his own fields. The pattern was clear as day because the windbreaks hadn't made the drought feel any easier, but they had made the farm survivable without needing a bank loan. That was the whole difference between the two men, and it wasn't about getting rich, but rather the simple ability to get through a hard stretch without taking on the kind of debt that dictates every move you make the following season. Roy decided to buy a much bigger irrigation pump after that third dry year, choosing a submersible model that could pull water from the aquifer faster than the old one. He told everyone it was just an insurance policy for the future, and while Dustin understood the logic of needing water now, he also knew the aquifer had a floor, and that irrigation pipes couldn't rebuild topsoil. The rains finally returned in 1997, with good moisture in April and May, and since prices were decent, Roy's yields recovered enough that his borrowed money started to feel manageable again. By 1998, those drought years felt like a bad memory that was finally over, becoming the kind of thing people reference in passing without really dwelling on the details. Dustin just kept updating his notebook. He wrote 1994 to 1996 on a fresh page and drew a heavy line under it. Then he started a new set of columns to track whatever the next year had in store. He didn't look at those pages as proof of his success or Roy's failure, but he saw them as a quiet record of what the ground had done during the struggle. Proof is something you show to an audience to win an argument, but a record is something different entirely. A record just requires one person who is willing to pay attention and write the truth down. The late 1990s and the start of the 2000s were mostly good years for the farmers in the county. The rain showed up right when the crops needed it most, and since commodity prices stayed high enough to make the math work, it felt like the whole region was finally proving its worth. Roy was able to refinance his debt at much better terms, and in 2002, he bought the quarter section of land directly to his south. He immediately tore out the last remaining shelter belt on that property line to gain 14 more acres of clean cropland, and that spring, he ran his new planter across the whole thing in one long and unobstructed pass. His operation became the kind of success story people pointed to at the grain elevator when they wanted to show what a modern farm should look like. Dustin spent his time planting eastern red cedars on his north edge in 2001 and added Norway spruce in 2004 to fill a gap on the west side. He'd noticed that opening widening the winter before, and it had been bothering him ever since. He bought young trees both times, using the same bare root stock from the conservation district he'd used back in the 80s, and the price was so low it wasn't even worth mentioning in the books. He spaced the saplings exactly 8 feet apart and spent the following summer driving through them with a small utility tractor that would have looked like a child's toy compared to the massive equipment Roy was running. He even got down in the dirt to cultivate around each tree by hand where the tractor couldn't get close enough without nicking the bark. 2 of Roy's hired hands stopped their truck on the road one afternoon and just watched him work for a long time without saying a word. Dustin noticed the silence and the staring, but he just kept his head down and finished the row. A joke started making the rounds that season, which Dustin eventually heard secondhand from his wife's cousin, who seemed to think the story was worth repeating. The neighbors were saying that Dustin was busy farming 1938, while Roy was already farming tomorrow. And while that was the polite version that got back to him, there were likely much sharper things being said behind his back. What none of those people saw was something that wasn't visible from the road and didn't show up in the yield reports that the neighbors talked about. The young trees Dustin had put in the ground back in 1989 were finally mature enough to do the job they were hired for. Those eastern red cedars he'd planted while the hired hands watched and laughed were now 15 years old, standing 30 feet tall on the north edge and growing dense enough that you couldn't see through them even in the dead of winter. The gap he had worried over in 1989 had transformed into the strongest and most reliable section of his entire north windbreak. He wasn't actually farming for the current year at all. He was farming for 20 years down the road. And those trees he planted in 2001 and 2004 weren't really for him, but they were for whatever the farm would need in 2021 or 2024. He was preparing for a season he hadn't reached yet and couldn't fully see, but he knew it was coming. When Roy finally finished removing that shelter belt on the south property line, Dustin stood at his own fence and looked at the new gap the way you look at a front door left wide open in the middle of winter. The wind didn't rush in and ruin everything immediately, and the cold didn't change the soil overnight, but the vulnerability was there. You just knew the weather would find that opening eventually, and the longer it stayed open, the harder it was going to be to fix the damage. He made a note about the missing trees in his notebook and left the rest of the page blank, which served as its own kind of record for the years to come. The thing about catastrophic wind events is that the land tells you they're coming long before the sky does, but you have to know how to listen to the language it speaks. 3 dry winters in a row had left the topsoil across most of southwestern Kansas in a condition that doesn't photograph well and never makes the local news. It just sits there, loose and unanchored, because the surface particles have disconnected from each other due to the absence of moisture and the lack of root mass. Without anything holding the structure together at the microscopic level, where soil health actually lives, the ground becomes a ghost of itself. When you walk across a field in that condition during February, the crust breaks under your boot with a sound like paper tearing. And that specific sound means something. Dustin knew exactly what it meant. Roy's fields were as exposed as ground gets in this part of the country. He had been running conventional tillage through the fall, which left the soil bare through the winter months just like most other operations in the county did. The residue was incorporated and the surface was clean and ready for spring, but that meant nothing stood between the topsoil and whatever the wind decided to do with it. There were no shelter belts, no cover crops, and no unharvested stubble left upright to catch what blew. It was just open ground from one fence line to the next. 300 and some acres of dirt pointed directly into the prevailing southwest wind. Dustin watched the horizon the way his grandfather had taught him to watch it years ago. He didn't look at the forecast, because a forecast only tells you what the Weather Service thinks is coming, which isn't the same as what the ground says is already here. Instead, he watched the dust that lifted off the gravel road at midday and failed to settle the way it should. He watched the horizon at dusk turn a shade of orange that wasn't quite a sunset, which is the color that tells you fine particles are already suspended in the air miles away. He walked his fence lines and pressed his thumb into the soil in the corners where the wind had been working quietly for weeks. And the grit he felt confirmed what his eyes had been suggesting. The windbreaks on his property were in good shape for the most part. The 1989 cedars on the north edge were mature and dense, and the Norway spruce he had put in on the west side back in 2004 had established themselves well. However, 2 gaps had been opening slowly over the last few seasons. One was on the northwest corner, where a section of aging green ash had lost 3 trees to a wet spring, and a shorter gap sat on the east side where deer pressure had killed the young plantings twice. Neither gap was particularly large on its own, but together they weighed on his mind. He remembered reading about a storm event analyzed by researchers at the University of Illinois, where a single improperly placed tree line had failed completely as a windbreak. It didn't fail because the trees weren't there, but because the gap was in the wrong place, and the wind found it the same way water finds a crack in a foundation. Placement and continuity weren't just secondary considerations for a farmer.
They were the whole thing. The week before the storm arrived, Dustin borrowed a flatbed trailer and drove it to a brush pile he'd kept from a fall cleanup. He spent 2 long afternoons packing the worst gaps with cut cedar branches, stacking them dense and wiring them tight to the existing fence posts. His grandfather had described this practice once in a letter Dustin found in a box of farm papers after the old man passed away. They were called temporary brush fills, and while almost nobody did it anymore, Dustin did it anyway. He worked until the gaps were closed well enough that the wind would have to struggle to find a way through. He finished the job on a Sunday afternoon. The storm arrived Tuesday morning. Tuesday morning came in gray and still, which is how bad weather often behaves before it stops being polite. By 8 o'clock, the wind had found its direction, and by 10, it had found its speed. By the time noon rolled around, Roy's fields were moving. They weren't just blowing, they were moving. And there is a massive difference between those two things. Blowing is what happens in a quick gust, creating a visible curtain of dust that rises and settles and is gone in a moment. What happened to Roy's ground that first afternoon was slower and much more total. The fine, dark surface layer lifted in a continuous sheet that looked less like a cloud and more like a skin peeling northeast at 40 miles per hour. If you stood at the south end of his property and looked north, the air above his fields had a thick, heavy color that the air above Dustin's simply didn't have. The wind held steady at 40 to 55 miles per hour through that first night. There was no rain and no front moving through to reset the conditions. It was just sustained southwest pressure, hour after hour. The kind of relentless event the Great Plains produces when the pressure gradient locks in and refuses to shift. By the second morning, the county road between the two farms was starting to drift. It wasn't deep yet, but the tire tracks Dustin left while driving out to check his north fence line were the only marks in the surface. Everything else had been smoothed over by material that hadn't started the day there. He pulled over and got out of his truck, standing with his back to the wind and squinting toward the northeast. What he saw was Roy's farm reduced to a brown haze at its own edges, with the topsoil so thoroughly in suspension that the buildings looked like soft, blurry shapes inside the dust. Then he turned around and walked into his own fields to see how they were holding up. On the windward side of the north shelter belt, the noise was a sustained roar that made you feel the wind in your chest before you even thought about it. The cedars were taking the full force of the gale, bending at the tops but holding firm at the roots with their branches locked together in a mass. 20 feet past the tree line, the sound changed completely. It wasn't silence because wind never truly goes silent, but there was a real and measurable drop from a roar that felt like ordinary weather. 40 feet in, standing in his winter wheat, Dustin held his hand out flat and felt the air moving at maybe 10 miles an hour, which was well below the threshold for erosion. The soil stayed exactly where it was. He walked the full length of the north edge and then the west edge to check both gaps he had filled with brush the previous week. The brush was holding, though it wasn't perfect. Some of the branches had shifted, and one wire tie had pulled loose, but the gaps were closed well enough that the wind was going over and around the barrier rather than through it. He rewired the loose section with a spare piece from his jacket pocket that he'd brought along on purpose. On the third day, Roy finally called. He didn't say much at first, and Dustin could hear the wind howling through the phone line. That meant Roy was outside standing in the middle of it, looking at something he needed to understand by being right in front of it. When he did speak, his voice had the flat, hollow quality of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. He admitted he didn't know yet how much he'd lost,
but he said the fences on the north side were buried. They weren't just drifted against, they were buried deep, with the posts still visible, but the wire gone under the dirt. He said it had happened faster than he ever thought possible, and then he stopped talking for a long moment. Dustin didn't try to fill the silence. There wasn't anything to fill it with. The storm ran through its third day and finally quit sometime Wednesday night when the pressure shifted and the wind dropped to something ordinary by Thursday morning. When Dustin drove the county road at first light, the drifts across the pavement had hardened overnight into ridges that scraped the undercarriage of his truck. He had to slow down to crawl over them. They were heavy and solid, and they were not going anywhere on their own. The accounting took longer than the storm did. Roy walked his north fields on a Thursday morning once the wind finally died down and the sky turned that clean, deep blue you only see after a front like that passes through. It looked like the air itself had been rinsed. What he found wasn't really a field anymore in any way that mattered for farming. The surface was pale from the fence line south for nearly 200 yards, but it wasn't the kind of pale you see when the ground gets dry in August. It was the color of the mineral substrate that sits under the organic layer, a sign that the dark, living part of his soil was simply gone. This new ground wouldn't hold moisture or feed a root system the way it used to, and it would take years of hauling amendments and planting cover crops before it produced anything like it had just 1 week ago. Soil scientists measure what an event like this takes in tons per acre. Roy's most exposed ground consisted of 300 acres that ran clean from fence line to fence line with no trees to stop the wind, and it had pointed directly into 3 days of 50-mile-per-hour gusts. The loss was at the high end of what those measurements can even capture. This wasn't some abstract number for experts to debate in an office, because you could see the damage clearly just by driving past on the road. 3 other farms in the county ended up in the same condition, and every one of them was an operation that had pulled out their shelter belts back in the 80s or 90s to make room for bigger equipment. Their common thread wasn't just bad luck or being in the path of a slightly worse gust of wind. The real connection was a decision made 20 years earlier that looked like a smart move for efficiency at the time, but now it looked like something else entirely. Dustin drove over 2 days after the storm ended, and he and Roy walked those north fields together without saying much of anything. There isn't a version of that walk that requires a lot of words to explain what happened. Dustin pointed once to where the soil had mounded up against the buried fence line, showing how the dirt had moved northeast in a long slope that was thickest where the wire finally stopped it. Roy looked at that pile of his own topsoil for a long time and gave a single nod. That was the only exchange they needed. Dustin's fields were normal, and that word is worth sitting with for a second. They weren't exceptional or magical or proof against a drought. They were just normal. The winter wheat he'd put in the ground back in October was still exactly where he'd planted it. The soil under the crop was the same color it had always been, and his yield that spring came in at the same level it had averaged for the last 5 years. When he opened his notebook to write the number down, it went into a column that had stayed consistent for 2 decades, which is really the only way to understand what consistency is actually worth to a farmer. The county extension office started getting calls the very week the storm quit blowing. 12 different farms reached out by the end of April to ask about shelter belt programs and which tree species they should pick for this climate. They were suddenly very interested in USDA cost-share programs that could help pay for the planting, even though those programs had been available for 20 years. The office had been recommending these exact trees to these exact farmers for 2 decades, but nobody had been interested until the wind took their topsoil. The extension agent was a woman named Carol who had been talking about windbreaks since before most of these callers had even taken over their farms. She handled the sudden rush of interest without showing any visible satisfaction or saying, "I told you so." She answered the questions the same way she always had, sent out the same paper planting guides, and scheduled the same site visits. She had seen this cycle before, and while the storm was new, the conversation that follows a disaster is always the same. She knew exactly how it went. She also knew how it usually ended once the memory of the dust faded, which is why she made sure to answer every single call while people were still listening. Roy planted his trees the following spring. He bought eastern red cedar bare root stock through the same conservation district program Dustin had been using since 1989. A USDA cost share program covered a good chunk of the bill, which was a lucky break because Roy's budget after the storm was tight enough that every single expense required a long conversation. He put the saplings on the north and west edges of his land, which were the same edges that had just spent 3 days screaming at him about what they needed. Dustin came over on a Saturday morning with a hand-drawn map he'd made at his kitchen table, and they walked the fence lines together to mark the spots. Dustin showed him where the rows should go and how to angle them against the prevailing wind, making sure to keep the spacing tight so they didn't end up with gaps that let the wind whistle through. Roy listened to the advice without interrupting a single time, and his silence was its own kind of answer to the years he'd spent ignoring the same suggestions. The young trees went into the dirt 8 feet apart in double rows, using the same spacing and species that had protected Dustin's farm for years. They were only 18 inches tall when they went into the ground, and Roy stood there looking at them for a while once the work was finished. 18 inches of skinny sapling isn't an impressive sight when you actually need 30 feet of mature cedar to stop a gale. The math of growing a forest is slow, and there is absolutely no way to hurry the process along. He'll have to drive his tractor around those trees for years before they do anything useful for the soil. He is going to lose the first 2 rows of cropland inside the tree lines because the roots will compete for water, which is the same sacrifice he'd spent 20 years mocking on Dustin's farm. He used to call those empty rows a waste of good money, but he finally saw them for what they actually were.
They weren't the price of failure. They were just the cost of entry if you wanted to keep your ground. Those trees won't truly protect his fields for another 15 years, and he knows that better than anyone. He planted them anyway, and that is the only version of this story that ends in a place worth going. The notebook Dustin had kept since 1987 was sitting on his table the afternoon he helped Roy plan the new windbreak. It held 20 years of yield columns and moisture readings along with wind observations, forming a careful record of what that specific piece of ground did through every season the plains could throw at it. He hadn't opened the book in a while because he didn't really need to anymore. The numbers were so familiar that he carried the history of the land around in his head. Nothing in that notebook was a new discovery. The original Prairie States Forestry Project had documented every bit of that data by the time the government ended the program in 1942. They knew about the yield benefits and the moisture retention and exactly how far downwind a row of trees could protect a crop. That knowledge had existed for 50 years before Dustin even inherited his farm, and it hadn't gone anywhere. It just stopped being the kind of information that felt necessary during the years when planters got bigger and fields got cleaner. In the seasons when the rain stayed steady and the prices held, the old knowledge started to feel like something from a different era. That is the problem with the kind of wisdom that only matters during an emergency. It looks like a useless superstition until the day the emergency actually arrives. What Dustin held on to for 20 years wasn't a secret method or a genius bet against the rest of the industry. It was something completely ordinary, just rows of trees along the edges of a field that his grandfather had put there in 1938. The people in the 1980s decided those trees weren't important anymore, but keeping them required a specific kind of stubbornness. It took the sort of long memory you only get from spending enough time on one piece of ground to understand its whole history instead of just focusing on this year's harvest. The soil is still there on Dustin's farm, and in the end, that is the whole story. Roy's young cedars will reach 30 feet tall around 2040, and by then, whoever farms that ground next will look at those tree lines without knowing why someone planted them or what was lost to make the work feel necessary. This kind of knowledge travels through the ground rather than through books, which is why these stories matter.
If this felt familiar to you, subscribe to the channel because there are more stories like this one, and most of them never get told.